Please join me in welcoming Evan Regan-Levine, the CSO of JBG Smith. We've got Kapil Bakshi, the distinguished engineer in the Cisco CTO office. We have Eric Paterson, the executive director of the National Security Institute at Virginia Tech, and Mr. Young Biang, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisitions, Logistics, and Technology at the U.S. Department of Defense.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Evan Regan-Levine. I'm Chief Strategy Officer of JBG Smith. For those of you who haven't heard of us, which might be probably everyone in the crowd, we are an investor who invests primarily in real estate and largely in this region, but we tend to invest at scale in the path of growth. And we think one of the most dynamic areas of growth right now is actually at the intersection of defense, technology, and academia. And we think we have that right here in a neighborhood called National Landing, anchored by the Pentagon, Amazon, Virginia Tech's Innovation Campus. And we think that is an area that's at the nexus of a lot of this tremendous growth in what we're seeing in the AI space and where SCSP and others are really starting to participate. So I'm here to moderate the discussion and really focus in with panelists here on how do we create an innovation district? How do we use an innovation district to drive growth in talent, in new technology adoption, in scale for a lot of the different kinds of companies that are here today out on the floor? So I want to start with a very, very high level beginning question. And I'm going to pose this to all the panelists so they can have a chance to introduce themselves. And that first question is really a high level one, but what do you think the role of AI is at the nexus of the private and the public sector, particularly in support of national security? Basically, what are we all here trying to solve? And then we'll talk about how that intersects with place. So we'll start with you, Mr. Bay.
So thanks. You want me to do myself?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm Young Bang. I'm the principal deputy for ASALT. And if y'all don't know what ASALT is, it's a big title. But we're responsible for all the weapons in the Army. We're responsible for all the computer systems, the data systems, the artificial intelligence systems, anything that essentially gets built, bought, or integrated, we're responsible for. And my background is really around the technology space. So acquisition, logistics, and technology. I was actually brought on board to bring the T back into the technology component of that. So going back to your question, Evan, I think that a lot of what the Army and the DoD wants to do is actually adopt a lot of the technologies faster and better. And when you think about AI, there is a lot of intersections there. I do think that there's a lot of utility in adopting what commercial industry is already doing. Because really, we're not going to do artificial intelligence better than industry, right? But we will be really aggressive about adopting it and using it for our own missions. And then we may actually have to do some retraining or some additional inference learning for specific data. But I think the intent is to leverage commercial as much as possible, use that as an intersection, like you said, between DoD, industry, and academia, and then look at the whole life cycle of how do we actually look at the workforce, how do we mature the technology, and then how do we actually use it specifically for our mission.
Great. Kapil, what about you?
Thank you. So I'll go ahead and introduce myself. So my name is Kapil Bakshi. I'm a distinguished engineer at Cisco Systems, and I sit in the CTO office. I live in the Washington, D.C. area, which means I've been working with the government for almost 30 years. And I've seen all the different adoptions and technology trends, if you will. In my role at Cisco, what I do is essentially track and consummate technology trends, technical strategies, both taking from the public industry, in this case, the government, bringing in for product development, and also working with public industries to craft a technical strategy based on what we see, what we deliver in the government area or in the industry itself. But this is a great time to be, right? In terms of when I say it's really a nexus, that's the right word to use in my mind. It's a perfect storm when it comes to AI, right? Why weren't we talking about AI even 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago? Why now? In fact, why since October 2022, since ChatGPT went public, right? Where was AI before that? And just to piggyback on your comments, right? The industry has been seeing AI ups and downs. We've been through 2 AI winters, at least in my lifetime. I don't think there's an AI winter coming anytime soon. And why is that? The perfect storm in the Nexus is because of multiple things. One, the computing power to analyze or run AI models is ubiquitous. It's enormous and easily accessible, thanks to all the private public cloud models. Second is because data is collected, both structured and data, unstructured data, at an unprecedented rate. Most of it's coming in past 10, 15, 20 years, if you look at the history of data. The third part is actually the development framework and the research, which is the public-private part, to consummate AI and consume it has been phenomenal, right? And could not be done only by the private sector itself. You put all these things together, and then you can deliver an outcome or a use case like you talked about, which can be used, especially when it comes to national security or competitiveness. It becomes an enormous nexus for us to be here and look at things. How can we adopt it? How can we responsibly use it? How can we partner with it? And how can we, the most pressing challenge is create a talent vortex so we can have people who can deliver these things, right? That's my take on it.
Mr. Paterson, you're in a unique role. You sit in the academic space, and I think a lot of what you do obviously supports not only the talent pools that drive what Mr. Bang and Mr. Bakshi work on, but as you think about research and technology transfer, talk to us a little bit about Virginia Tech's role in the world of artificial intelligence. What are you doing to address some of the challenges of both industry and government at a high level?
Yeah, well, thank you, Evan. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name's Eric, and I'm the director of the National Security Institute. And a couple of the themes that I've heard in the various talks here have been about speed and agility. And from my point of view, as director of the National Security Institute, achieving speed and agility, we need to work together in new ways, really at this intersection between industry, government, and academia, and break down some of these obstacles to really achieving the speed that we need. It really is a time for America to achieve this long-term competitiveness for a future where AI and other technologies are underpinning our economic success.
Mr. Bang, that's interesting, and I'm going to turn to you first on this, but as you describe your role, a lot of what you seem to do is involved in maintaining the competitiveness that Eric was just talking about. And as you think about the requirements for national security today and for the work that you work on, are we prepared? Are the traditional sort of big names of the defense industrial complex, are they equipped today to support the kinds of challenges that you're facing, especially as things like AI become more prevalent?
Yeah, that's a good question, Evan. I think for me, I always thought about meeting in the middle. And I think that as we meet industry in the middle, we ask industry to meet in the middle. Right? I think there is a similar analog for our traditionals and our innovators or startup community as well. Right? And so I think one of the things that our large traditionals do well is they can take technologies and apply it to our specific mission. Right? So they are looking at the outcomes of that we want, and they're good at incorporating technology. But they're also pretty big and scaled in a good way, but also that doesn't necessarily incentivize innovation. And so we would like them to work with a lot of the startups or the commercial companies that don't necessarily focus on the Army or DoD. And arguably, they create a lot more innovative ideas and technology, and then maybe marry them together, meet in the middle, so that we can have startups or commercial companies who've not done business in the government understand that their technology is great, but it might not meet our mission outcome until they actually tailor what they're doing for us. And then same thing, have the large traditionals work with some of these companies or with the Army to look at how do we take some of these innovations that startups are doing a lot better and faster, and then help them also tailor the outcome as well. So again, I think it's a little bit of meet in the middle on both sides.
So you spent a lot of time at Cisco, Mr. Bakshi, really thinking about how you pitch to the federal government. You hear, Mr. Bang, your client here, talk about that. How do you sort of access that startup ecosystem? How do you access Cisco's internal capabilities in the commercial sector to tailor it to these, it sounds like, new and emerging needs on the federal side? How are you adapting to that kind of technology change?
Yeah, 100%, right? And there are several broad strokes in the strategy that how do we come and meet to the demands of the market, if you will. In this case, the market being the government or the public sector, especially in the case of AI, right? So as part of Cisco, we have what we call a big organization called Outshift. And essentially, that's a clever name to go out and look out and a little bit shift to the right, if you were to look for new technologies, new areas, and incubate them, right? And we have a whole notion of 1 degree of separation from Cisco, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, and how far out is it from the core competency of what we do? But essentially, infrastructure enablement to connectivity, compute, data centers, AI being the workload. So we're looking out all for these technologies and trends, multiple dimensions out there for Cisco, and we try to incubate that, right? And the fail fast strategy is implemented there so that if we try a few things, if they don't work out for whatever reason, let's fail fast and move on. And if they do move out, let's put that into the product's life cycles part of it so we can bring it to the public part of it. That's one broad stroke strategy of how are we doing that. The other strategy is the classic Cisco, if you will. I've been here 16 years, and we acquire about 10 to 17, 18 companies, small, big, large, every year, right? And that's part of the strategy of develop, build, and invest, right? Either we develop technologies, incubate them organically, or we invest in things, either via direct investment out there for something that's interesting that could consummate, or in a public sector or in academia. And finally, we go about and acquire things from the PK. That's how we're filling up the spectrum of technologies that could be leveraged by anybody in the industry, especially public sector. And for public sector itself, we have an entire organization waiting to sort of take these products that we deliver and, if you will, adopt them or go through adaptation process for the government, either DoD or the intelligence or civilian or global governments for that matter, right? And as part of that adaptation, we go through all the compliance, all the regulations, all parts of it to make sure it's for that specific industry. All these things are thought through in the entire life cycle of our product development, all the way from incubation to investment to delivery.
Great. No, that's very interesting. And, I think about the glue between some of these aspects that you talked about around finding that product market fit with the government user, and on the government side, trying to reach deeper into the commercial sector, even to startups. Virginia Tech, you're opening a new innovation campus in Arlington. And what is your goal for that? I know you're really trying to connect increasingly the government side, particularly defense, with industry, and also foster more of a startup ecosystem. Because, when I hear Kapil talk about going out and acquiring technology or companies, you have to have a thriving ecosystem to do that. And I think you just look around this room, the amount of incredible innovation startup community is starting to get bigger here in this region. How do you sort of see the innovation campus that you're opening up starting to address the issue of being that glue between industry and government and the startup community?
Well, first and foremost, the innovation campus was really spurred by the need to close the tech talent pipeline. So at the core, right, the universities are all about developing the future workforce. And so the innovation campus was originally stood up to really fill the gap in computer science and computer engineering. However, our presence in the DC area is much larger than that. And it's really about working in the DC area is special, and so while we maintain we have the main campus of Virginia Tech is in Blacksburg, we have a very rapidly growing presence in the DC area, and we treat it as a very special place where we work side by side with government partners and industry partners. And then in addition, really contribute to the innovation and spin out culture, where I can point to a number of companies that have sprung from technology developed at the university. Furthermore, as a leader at a thematic research institute, a big part of our goal is really to work in the applied research space. The reason for that is universities are well known for the fundamental research, of course. But there's an immediate gap transitioning that technology that faculty and their students might work on for years. How do we quickly, it goes back to that speed and agility, how do we quickly transition it into the applied space and then work with inserting it into the government and in corporate America?
Mr. Bang, how does the government look at that? How do you hear that? How does that resonate with you? Does it resonate with you?
Yeah,
Do you need to be near it?
Yeah, I think that's music to our ears, right? So if you look at different geographies, say Silicon Valley or Silicon Alley up in New York or all these other places, they're really a huge ecosystem, like you said, right? Academia, from basic research to applied research. They're a pipeline of students that are graduating in STEM degrees. They also are a pipeline for startups as well as companies that are innovating across the board. And so if you think about that, DC is the largest industry is GovCon. The DoD is right here in the Pentagon, right in Crystal City. Virginia Tech's national landing with y'all is a really close geographic area. I'm like, why can't we do a similar thing, right? Slightly different model, but I think we should be looking at that, right? How do we develop a pipeline of students that are STEM related, that understand technology, that could feed startups, that could feed incubators, accelerators, that could feed companies that are looking to do M&As, right? And that also keeps the talent locally here, right? I think we need more of those type of folks. We need that ecosystem to support the DoD. And again, if you can use it from a dual use, all the better. But again, I don't think that we should have a talent draw from the DC area just to go to Silicon Valley because that's the only ecosystem that's out.
What's the hardest thing when you think about that ecosystem in terms of sustaining those companies? How do they get from a great startup idea, maybe spitting out of Cisco or Virginia Tech? How do they get to work with you? How do they get to the point where their technology can be deployed for the federal user?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. But if you think about a lot of the work that's done in the DoD, there are several mechanisms that enable that investment directly to startups, directly to good capabilities, directly to academic institutions. So if you look at UARCs, ASALT, with our AFC colleagues in the labs, commission all the UARCs for all the universities, right? So basic and applied research, right? And there's funding and money that goes with that. All right, if you look at startups as well as non-traditionals, we have what's called SIBRs or XTech, where you can get, depending on the efforts, 2 million and 5 million right off the bat. And the Army has actually accelerated that, where we can actually do awards on average of 21 days.
Wow.
Sometimes as fast as 10 days. If we see great technology, we can get that out there to smart organizations that have a capability that we need. So, those are smaller dollar scales, but if you think about that, you can look at that almost as a couple of those can be like angel investors, right? And as you mature that, you might go for an A round or a B round. Well, we have phase 1 and phase 2 SIBRs that could get you more money, right? And then when you mature that, those could actually land in the contract. So I would also say that akin to the whole startup community and how investments are made, there's similar analogs on the defense side that I think can be used to fund and or augment, right, the same type of funding that goes on in the Silicon Valley community.
Interesting. Yeah, sure, go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, Evan, I was going to follow up Young's comments there. One of the things that we're doing, I listened to General Rainey's talk. He's general in charge of Army Futures Command. And earlier this morning, he was talking about some of the things that academia really has to do. We're already doing them because the fact that we're in Washington. So the fact is, you have to lean in and really start to solve some of the problems about recruiting students into government service and understanding that they can work for people like Mr. Bang, but still get a chance to work with all the companies that are in this space. So today, for example, at the National Security Institute, I have 1,000 cleared or clearable U.S. citizens that are ready to get to work.
How big of a problem, Kapil, is talent for you guys?
Yeah.
As you think about this, because you've got to grow, you've got to service these accounts, these customers.
Yeah.
Is clearable talent hard to find? Is it hard to get people to work on these types of projects in the defense space?
So that's a great thread, by the way. We've just invoked on talent. And before I get to talent, I want to pull one thread that was mentioned around, I think you mentioned applied research, right? I really like that term applied research because it's not just pure research, but it's applied, and there's a play on the words, if you will. So we at Cisco, we don't do pure research where we're smashing atoms because that's what academia is good at. But we do applied research in partnership with academia, where we fund, PIs, principal investigators, and their teams to do research that could be applied to our specific problem sets that we are trying to solve for the industry, for the government, and for the public sector, right? And this whole partnership of public, private, and funding applied research, so it can fuel our core competency, which can fuel back to the public sector, it falls in our incubation and technology group vis-a-vis Outshell. So that's one thing I want to address. The talent question is actually really, really good, right? And if any one of you, all of us, we've been tracking this, according to National Cyber and Education Strategy, if I get it right, which was released by White House in last year, and there are many versions of it by previous administrations, there's an enormous gap of cyber and tech skills right now as opposed to what we need. And the gap's going to widen if we don't do anything about it. So what are we in commercial industry at Cisco trying to do? A few things, right? How many of you have heard of Cisco Network Academies, right? Yes, I see a few hands. Ever since Cisco been alive, we have network academies where we train earlier career, sort of like trade school or veterans or anybody who wants to come in and get basic infrastructure, networking, cybersecurity skills. And we literally train hundreds and thousands of people to go and tackle those tough problems for the industry, including public sector. That's network academies, right? Everybody, I'm one of the members who goes about teaching just as a giving back to the community, if you will. That's number one. That's locally, if you will, in US and in industries around US and public sector. Globally, and talking about AI, especially AI Expo, the US European Union Trade Council has an entire task force which Cisco is leading. In fact, we're co-leading with a lot of big vendors here, if you will, in AI, where we are directly addressing to develop AI talent globally. And I think some of the audacious numbers that are being put out there is to train about 25 million AI competent folks by 2032, right?
Let's say 25 million people.
By 2032.
How big is that workforce now? Is say 25 million in the future?
The workforce is very small. There's a huge gap. Most of the workforce actually works for the big AI companies at this point. It's very hard to get those talent outside. And that's a gap. We have a similar gap on the cyber side, but the gap here is probably equal or bigger as we go forward, right? If you will. So all those things are put in place, and we realize that this is a huge talent gap. And if you don't fill it, the industry is going to implode in itself, right? And bad actors may come in.
I mean, I think about that. If Cisco's dealing with this, and Cisco, big private sector, enterprise, national, global scale. How do you deal with this in the Department of Defense? I mean, can you pay people what he can pay them? I mean, how do you drive that workforce?
So I'm glad you asked that because I did want to double tap on a couple of points that you made earlier, right? If you look at cyber, we're facing a critical shortage on cyber skills, and we've been doing it for 2 decades.
Yeah.
Right? Not just in the DoD or Intel sector, just across the world. And so unless we think about the problem differently, we're going to fall into the same trap of AI skills, 25 million by 32 that you said. We're going to still be chasing that gap, and having that talent in the Army or DoD, it's a vicious cycle. And my whole point is we should learn from those same mistakes from the cyber side, right? We shouldn't be doing the same approach 20 years later and still have shortage of cyber personnel and do that same thing for AI. And so I think that's why the whole notion of working with academia and industry is so attractive. If you look at Silicon Valley, most of the people that are out there that have been there a while have worked for all of the same companies at one point or another. But it's a rotating basis. They go from company to company, startup companies, get bought back, whatever it might be. But the way that we're thinking about it is like, if the Army is going to be the biggest consumer of AI, and the DoD is one of the biggest consumers of AI, right? We have enough critical mass here to drive an ecosystem differently. And so that same analog that you have in Silicon Valley of people going back and forth to companies, we want to create a similar scenario with academia here, right? In national landing area, close to the Pentagon, with industry. So people are already getting cleared. They're already getting informed on AI skills through academia. So they're not only just being computer scientists, they're computer science with a math background, right?
Yeah.
You need both. And then they're able to work with DoD, work with industry, already cleared, and they're already being able to focus on what the outcome of the technology should be versus saying, we're going to develop this tech, then we're going to train people, and then we're going to get cleared, and then we're going to look for the outcome for the DoD, right? So again, I think the notion that we're trying to say is we have all the pieces here on the Army and DoD side. We want to flip the script on the ecosystem and create an ecosystem here that's going to incubate all this talent, keep the local talent, and help us get to the outcomes faster.
Eric, how do you scale that? Because you talked about having 1,000 people ready to go, and then we're talking about what we need globally for 25 million. How do you think about scaling up, and what do you do to contribute to getting that ecosystem, the people power that it needs? We'll come back, we'll talk about capital in a minute, but how do you even think about scaling to that growth need?
Yeah, I mean, this is the key question. I mean, 25 million, that's an all hands on deck. It requires 20 other universities, 30 other universities that think and work like Virginia Tech does.
Correct.
Now, I can't control the whole educational system in the United States, but I know that we can expand locally at least another 5 times. There's no reason that we couldn't have 5,000 students working on national security problems. 25 million, that's a gap again that's going to require really, that's what this whole conference is about, right? AI Expo for national competitiveness. And I think it's going to require a lot more other of our similar universities really to take this on as a national imperative.
Well, I'm so interested. We think about that growth and that scale. We can all sort of engage on this, but what are some of the biggest impediments? It's not just getting people trained and cleared and into the system. It's got to be, you touched on this a little bit, Young, about just capital and the role that the DoD plays, but is there sort of a hard infrastructure component to that? Is it hard for a startup to come and enter that secure federal contracting space? Do they need a SCIF? Do they need certain fiber connectivity? How do you sort of make that more accessible? How do you lower some of those barriers to entry so you do get more of that flywheel effect of a startup ecosystem?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think security clearance is one issue that's been an obstacle in the past. And typically, it's like we said, industry develops tech, then we try to get cleared people, and then we use them to actually try to tailor the outcomes for the DoD. I think in this type of scenario, there's some innovative approaches that I think that we're looking at with Virginia Tech and industry to look at how do we shorten that security clearance process for one? How do we look at potentially things like SCIF as a service as another thing? How do we look at changing the dynamics so we're not actually after the cycle of technology and trying to get clearable people, which is a problem, right? So most technology is developed on the commercial side, and most of the people aren't necessarily clearable. And so we have a smaller subset of people that can actually work on our problems. Even if you have 25 million people worldwide, it's a very small subset. So again, we want to look at those things. We want to encourage more of the open campus feel. Literally like a college where you have open campuses. We want to be able to do more on the Army and DoD side in an open campus environment with academia and industry together. So really, if you think about it, not everything needs to have a clearance, but some things are going to have to. So if we look at how we do clearances differently and look at SCIFs differently, the bulk of that work can be done in a potentially non-cleared facility as well as non-cleared people, right? To get a certain percentage of the work done, and then you save the other smaller components that need clear personnel, for a smaller club.
Makes a lot of sense. Kapil, you had something to add there.
By the way, all those are great points from a government point of view. I want to give a technology point of view, if you will, that how would you scale that? That's a big question. That how do we get to this audacious goal? Can we meet it or not? That's what we're seeing. But how do we get to it? And I think what we're trying to do is pull a page out of the same strategy book we had for cyber, vis-a-vis humans versus machines, right, if you will, which is automation, right? How do we do things is actually automating things that would have to require humans, butts and seats, hands and keyboards could be automated in a certain sense. The same strategy could be applied at scale in the AI space, if you will, right, at this point, right? Think about a typical cyber sim, if you scenario. The analyst sitting here, who's one of the trained AI persons in cybersecurity, has to literally look at many, many events come through and sift through it and make analysis out of it, right? And since the domain is getting so big, it is humanly impossible to do it and miss things. And that's where automation, AI ops, things like that come in, which will help us scale those things, right? And these things are not new, but they've been around. We just have to pull the pages where you've done and morph it and adopt it in the
How do you drive that adoption? How do you actually make people use that technology to address the scale question?
Yeah, so, it's a technology adoption curve typically, right, if you will, right? That you first try to prove concept, pilot it, understand it, try to put it on low risk projects, and then scale it to high risk, and scale it to production, if you will, out there, perhaps in theater, and you go going forward. And then, before you do that, on the side, you're also doing compliance and regulation work, that you can adopt to a government scale, right? So, it's a typical modernization step that we typically do. Investment, proof concept, small pilots to big pilots to ubiquitous adoption, with all the compliance aspect of it.
Does it help you, Kapil, when you're doing that? We talked about, you were saying it's a campus. It's connecting the Pentagon with Virginia Tech. It's sort of being in the middle of that. As you're trying to drive adoption of this technology, as you're trying to make that, basically flatten that curve out a little bit, are you thinking about where Cisco physically is located? Do you have to actually showcase? Do you have to participate? Do you have to be part of a physical ecosystem to make that work? I know some of the, I remember visiting your offices by Georgia Tech. I was really impressed with what you're doing down there. How are you guys thinking about your own strategy to engage with people like Virginia Tech or Pentagon in these really critical innovation corridors?
Yeah, so in terms of us engaging with the academia and public sector, it's quite simple, right? We have a large presence with both academia and public sector. And we have entire teams dedicated to catering to those, right? We have centers across Silicon Valley. You mentioned several on the East Coast, New York, Atlanta, Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C. offices, where we're not only showcase, but actually do piloting of these new technologies as we go around, right? And piloting not from in one point of view, multiple point of views, where you can bring in multiple ecosystem players here, both on the product side, service side, compliance side, consulting side, to put an entire solution together. And the government being one of the strong constituents of that, right?
Yeah.
So we have pulled all that ecosystem together, if you will, and that's how we try to drive adoption in a holistic sense, generally speaking, right?
And do you, yeah,
I mean, so I think you're really getting at, do you physically now need to be there, or can you do things remotely? And for me, I think it's a hybrid environment, right?
Yeah.
So the latest tidbit I heard on WTOP the other day was only 30% of now the workforce want remote. 40 some odd percent actually want a hybrid, and then there's some that want to be physically always there. And I think depending on the scenarios, you may be more effective in a remote, you may be more effective, physically. But I think there is now a distinction in certain aspects where certain things like project and scrum teams may be more effective in person. Collaboration around innovations with multiple companies, organizations, and technology may also need a physical presence. So again, I think it's a hybrid environment. And again, it's not the days of everything remote or everything in person. It's got to be hybrid. And I think having physical space to enable that, as well as SIPR or as well as remote space, is going to be critical, again, around how the DoD is thinking about.
That's a great point. I just want to add one bit. Sure. The world has gone hybrid. I mean, we at Cisco, we've been hybrid remote even before the pandemic, just because we have hybrid technologies that we take to the industry and we sort of drink our own champagne too, in a matter of speaking, right? And the office you mentioned, the brand new offices we have retooled in Atlanta, New York, Silicon Valley, Chicago, the bases have hybrid mindset in mind, 100%, which means that consistency of immersive experience when you're working in a hybrid fashion, if you will, among your peers, within the office or on your desktop at home or in your kitchen, right? Or at even a client site, if you will, all have the exact same experience, if you will. So you don't get to feel that I'm in a different location. My experience remains consistent, right? That's a strategy that we are doing. That's how we showcase things also. That's how we pull things together also.
So that makes a lot of sense. And I think, one of the big missing pieces that I want to make sure we touch on in the ecosystem conversation here, because all of us are trying to foster an ecosystem. We're trying to do it around the idea of place, around intersectionality. But does capital get this? I mean, I saw a recent report from McKinsey and PitchBook that talked about just the growth in Series A, Series B, and seed rounds for effectively companies at the intersection of defense and technology. So there's a lot of money pouring into the space. There are 850 different funding rounds is the latest number that I saw in the last wave. The PitchBook's predicting 16% go forward CAGR in investment in this space. Does capital fundamentally get this? Do they understand it the way they do out in Silicon Valley? And what role, and we'll start maybe with Virginia Tech, how do you sort of build that capital ecosystem? Because it's great if you train a workforce, it's great if you research technology, but if that technology is turning only to the DoD for funding or having to get acquired by Cisco right away, you don't get that growth. How do you drive that education of capital in what we're trying to do here?
Well, that is a hard problem. And I will just say right up front, it's not an area that I personally have a lot of background in. I can point to a number of companies that have spun out, but usually it requires really passionate faculty or students who know the problems, who have a passion for it, who know that niche where it really has impact. And I can point to 3 or 4 companies today, Hawkeye 360, Federated Wireless. Companies like this are ones that came directly out of the Hume Center and the National Security Institute. Were we worried about capital? No. It was more about the ideas and generating the ecosystem for faculty and students to thrive and to really take time to launch a company. And it's so important at Virginia Tech that we've really stood up an entire organization called Link License and Launch, where that's their, a little bit of their concern is to help the faculty and empower them to really to make it to that very first 1, 2, 4, 3, 4 person company. And then later on, the growth part really becomes the capital problem.
So yeah,
So-
I want to just focus kind of on you here, because again, as the end customer and consumer of this, you want to foster some of this. Let's say there's a professor who's got a brilliant idea. They spin out of Virginia Tech. They're 2 or 3 people. They've got some angel investors. They're just starting out. How do you bridge that gap before their technology could really be applied to DoD? And does the capital that can fuel that, the people funding seed or Series A, do they get it? Do they get what it takes to mentor a company to work with you?
Yeah, I don't want to generalize because I'm not a banker, but observationally, I will say that I think there's a disconnect. I think there's opportunities for improvement. I think there's been some missteps, right? And so to your point, say hypothetically, a couple faculty and students from Virginia Tech have this amazing idea supporting the DoD they got, right? And they spin out a company. Great. They take on some angel investors. Great. Now, this is where I think personally there's a little bit of divergence from a Silicon Valley model and a Silicon Alley model, right? And I think the outcomes is really what drives behavior. And so the Silicon Valley model looks at certain niche capabilities that potentially will get a strategic buyer, right, to buy that. Whether they have a business model, whether the technology is scaled and maturable or manufacturable for that matter, they're really looking for a buyout. And I think that's okay for that model. But if you look at like the Silicon Valley model, they look at more things like, okay, great, it's good tech, but what about the company's leadership? And do they have a business model or a revenue stream? And that spurs more investment on the Silicon Alley model, right? And I don't think either of them are wrong. I think there's opportunities to leverage both to help accelerate. And then I would actually put it back and say, hey, there's funding that's available for angels. There's funding that comes from VCs. I would actually pose that question back to the private equity who actually inherit or actually are the customers for these venture capitalists or startups after they actually have an exit and get their take on it. But I do think that there seems to be observationally some themes across the board where I think there's opportunities to make that better and faster. And then again, I think the government has a role where we can help augment some of that with our own money and capital. But if the DoD's your only source of revenue, or we're the one client that a company is banking on, if I was an investor, I would not invest.
So are you seeing, I mean, that makes perfect sense to me, but are you seeing the successful startups who start to engage with you, who cross over those gaps that you talked about? Are they in DC? Are they in New York? Are they in Silicon Valley? What are we doing? Do we have that thriving ecosystem here? Can we build it up? What are we missing within this region? Because this is where we have the clearable talent.
I think that is the right question. I think we have pockets of successes across the board, whether Silicon Valley, whether Silicon Alley, whether it's Austin, Seattle, wherever. I think we have pockets of that's been extremely successful.
Yeah.
Where I'm looking at things from an acquisition standpoint is how do we accelerate that and how do we get scale? And I think a way, not the only way, is to augment that with having our own ecosystem here that we can actually help incubate, help foster, help accelerate, and help scale, right? So I think, again, partnerships like that with academia, with commercial industry, and the DoD is a mechanism to do that.
That's great. And I know we're just almost about out of time. So Kapil, why don't you add that and just sort of end us here with the idea of what can industry do from your perspective to help build that ecosystem even more, to accelerate it, to work with those startups, and just sort of react to Mr. Bang's statement, but give us your vision for how Cisco and industry broadly can support this emerging AI ecosystem.
Yeah, so the AI ecosystem is expanding very, very quickly. And really depends who you talk to and what you want to talk about. From a Cisco point of view, the way we're trying to expand ecosystem is that we're good at AI infrastructure, right? That's what we do. Networks, compute, data center, things like that. But that's not the entire part of the puzzle, if you will. We need other ecosystem players to come and play with us, both on the technology side and on the integration side. That's one way we're putting the solution together. On the other side, if you put those technology out, they have to be adopted, right? Otherwise, the technologies don't take off the ground. And that's where the adoption ecosystem comes into play. And the government area is full of adoption ecosystem, whether it's GovCon space or it's actually investment phase or it's actually piloting phase, we sort of latch onto that and go about doing that. The other part that we're trying to do is essentially, it comes back to the capital question that you're talking about, is we actually have several models to go about flowing capital, right? The traditional models in Valley are venture capital, private equity, things like that. We have Cisco Investments, where we make investments in technologies and other areas for a specific problem set or specific industry. So essentially, we're running our own investment back. And we have done investments, acquisitions, and organic development of things that are catered specifically for these kind of area, like AI system, ecosystem, defense, cybersecurity, things like that, right? Some of our acquisitions have been squarely focused on those kind of things. So we can get those things spun out and done very quickly.
Well, thank you so much. I want to thank the audience, thank the panelists. Great discussion today. Really appreciate all of you participating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.